At dawn on a cold morning in 1896, Emperor Menelik II stood on a ridge overlooking a battlefield that should not have existed. Below him, thousands of young Italian soldiers lay scattered across the rocky slopes of Adwa, their rifles abandoned, their banners torn, their commanders missing, or dead. Smoke hung in the air like a shadow of the disaster that had unfolded. Menelik watched silently as Ethiopian soldiers moved among the wounded, offering water to enemies who, hours earlier, had marched into the highlands, believing they were destined to rule over his people. The foreign dead stretched so far across the terrain that even the European newspapers would struggle to explain it. Kings in Europe would demand answers. The Vatican would send letters filled with panic and pleas. Something had happened that shook the foundations of colonial certainty. For the first time in the age of high colonialism, an African army had crushed a European empire in open battle. And at the center of this shattering moment stood a man the world had underestimated. Few outside Ethiopia understood how he had done it, and fewer still grasped what it would mean for Africa, for European colonial ambition, and for the church that had long claimed a monopoly on Christian authority. But the victory at Adwa did not happen by chance. It was the result of many choices, betrayals, and a struggle for survival that had begun years before a single Italian soldier set foot on Ethiopian soil. This is the story of Emperor Menelik II, the African king who would later expose the hypocrisy of the Vatican. In this video, we will follow the path that led to the clash at Adwa and the moment when an African emperor forced the world to admit a truth it had long denied. Before we continue, remember to subscribe if you want more narratives that challenge the filtered history that most of us have been taught. Your support makes it possible for us to keep uncovering remarkable moments like this, where Black resistance refused to bend and ended up changing the course of events. Now, let's begin this powerful journey into how Emperor Menelik II turned Adwa into a warning the Vatican could never ignore. In the highlands of East Africa, where ancient churches perch on mountaintops and the legacy of kings runs deep, a child was born destined to challenge the might of Europe. Sala Mariam, later crowned Emperor Menelik II, claimed lineage right from the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. From a young age, Menelik was immersed in the heritage of his people. He learned of Ethiopia's unique status as one of the world's oldest Christian nations, a place where Christianity took root in the 4th century and thrived independently. Surrounded by colonies and protectorates falling to European powers, Ethiopia was a Christian island in a sea of pagans, as Menelik himself observed. He came of age during quite a turbulent time. In his youth, Ethiopia was not yet a fully unified empire. Regional lords vied for power, and the threat of outside invasion loomed. Menelik proved to be ambitious and resourceful. By 1889, he ascended as Emperor of Ethiopia, inheriting a kingdom encircled by colonial ambitions. To the north, the Italians had seized neighboring Eritrea and dreamed of a new Roman Empire in the Horn of Africa. Italy was a newcomer to the colonial game, a recently unified European nation hungry for glory and recognition. Its leaders believed that conquering African lands would elevate Italy's status among the old imperial powers. They set their sights on Ethiopia, one of the last remaining independent African states. From the outset, Emperor Menelik II demonstrated shrewd diplomatic skill. He understood that Ethiopia needed modern weapons and allies to withstand European aggression. Menelik courted various foreign suppliers, acquiring rifles, artillery, and advisors. The French were eager to curry favor in the region and provided arms. Even the Italians, before revealing their true intentions, sold some weapons to Menelik. Most significantly, Menelik appealed to Russia, fellow Orthodox Christians who empathized with Ethiopia's plight and procured modern arms and military expertise from them. With each deal and shipment, Menelik was strengthening the sinews of Ethiopian defense, quietly preparing for the storm he knew was coming. By the late 1880s, storm clouds gathered. Italy approached Menelik with a friendship treaty that, on the surface, recognized Ethiopian sovereignty and promised support. In 1889, Menelik signed the Treaty of Wuchale. Little did he know, the treaty was merely a trap laid in 2 languages. In Amharic, the Ethiopian language, one clause said Ethiopia could use Italy's help in foreign relations if it wished. But the Italian version falsely stated that Ethiopia must conduct its foreign affairs through Italy, effectively making Ethiopia an Italian protectorate. This duplicitous translation was a deliberate trick by the Italian negotiators, an attempt to pull wool over the emperor's eyes while claiming to European powers that Ethiopia had willingly given up its sovereignty. When news of this deceit reached Menelik, his reaction was a mix of outrage and resolve. For a time, he pursued diplomacy. Menelik notified Italy that there was a misunderstanding and sought a correction, but Italy arrogantly insisted their version was official, effectively declaring Ethiopia a vassal state. Menelik II would not have it. By 1893, seeing no peaceful resolution, he tore up the treacherous treaty, publicly denouncing it and affirming Ethiopia's independence. His stance sent a clear message. Ethiopia was no nation's protectorate. As the rift widened, Menelik began rallying his people for the possibility of war. Empress Taytu Betul, Menelik's formidable wife and partner in rule, bolstered his resolve. Taytu was astute and fiercely patriotic. She immediately grasped the Italians' intent and urged her husband not to give an inch of Ethiopian sovereignty. In one encounter, when an Italian envoy warned that rejecting the protectorate would make Italy lose its dignity, Empress Taytu shot back defiantly, "We too must retain our dignity. You want other countries to see Ethiopia as your protege, but that will never be." Her words encapsulated the pride and determination of Ethiopians. They would not be anyone's protectorate or pawn. With Taytu's counsel, Menelik solidified a unified front among the nobility. Anyone still harboring pro-Italian leanings was won over or neutralized. The emperor and empress, a royal couple from different regions of Ethiopia, embodied the nation's unity. Together, they prepared to confront the looming Italian threat head-on, with righteousness on their side and rage in their hearts at the betrayal they had suffered. The year 1895 arrived with the drumbeats of war echoing across Ethiopia's mountains and valleys. Emperor Menelik II sent out a historic call to arms, summoning provincial rulers, warriors, and even peasants from every corner of his realm. Messengers galloped out with orders to mobilize. Church bells rang from the ancient rock-hewn churches, rallying the faithful to defend their motherland. Menelik proclaimed that the Italians had violated Ethiopia's honor and sought to enslave its people under colonial rule. In response, entire communities, farmers, pastoralists, nobles, and priests alike rose with weapons or whatever tools they had. The cause transcended local feuds. Diverse ethnic groups, who at times had been rivals, now united against a common enemy. This sense of unity was unprecedented. Ethiopia, with its mosaic of cultures and languages, came together as one. The Italians had hoped to exploit Ethiopian divisions, but instead their aggression forged an even stronger national resolve. Across the Italian colony of Eritrea, on Ethiopia's northern border, the Italian army gathered its forces to invade. Rome's government, led by expansionist officials and fired up by notions of imperial glory, expected a quick and easy campaign. Italian politicians and generals spoke openly of bringing civilization and Catholic Christianity deeper into Africa, a rhetoric laced with biased assumption and religious hypocrisy. They portrayed their mission as uplifting backward people, even though Ethiopia already had an ancient Christian church and civilization of its own. In Italy's view, Menelik's Orthodox Christian nation was not the right kind of Christian, not under the Pope's authority, and thus fair game for conquest. This unspoken bias revealed the Vatican's complicity by silence. The Catholic hierarchy did not object to Italy's designs on Ethiopia. Indeed, behind closed doors, many in the Vatican saw an opportunity. If Italy could colonize Ethiopia, the Catholic Church could finally establish dominance over the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, correcting what they saw as a schism that had lasted since antiquity. It was a double standard of faith, preaching Christian brotherhood in theory, but supporting the subjugation of fellow Christians in practice. As Italian troops marched southward, they carried modern rifles, artillery, and the confidence of a European army convinced of its superiority. Many young Italian soldiers, however, had no idea of the fierce resistance awaiting them. They were told the campaign would be a quick adventure, a chance to earn glory for Italy and souls for the Church. Some Italian officers openly scoffed at the idea that African savages could stand against them. Their hubris would soon meet reality. Menelik's spies kept him informed of every Italian movement. The emperor stockpiled huge quantities of munitions and provisions. By late 1895, he had assembled a massive army. Estimates range upward of 100,000 Ethiopian fighters, armed with everything from rifles purchased abroad to swords, spears, and shields passed down through generations. What the Ethiopians lacked in uniform equipment, they made up for in sheer numbers, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and a passionate cause. They were fighting for their freedom, their land, and their faith. Crucially, women played an integral role in the Ethiopian war effort. Empress Taytu herself took command of a contingent of troops, becoming a symbol of courage for both women and men. Thousands of other Ethiopian women marched alongside the army as nurses, cooks, water carriers, and sometimes as warriors bearing arms. They managed logistics in unbelievably difficult conditions, hauling supplies over mountains, tending to wounded fighters, and even joining the fray when needed. The entire nation, down to families and villages, was invested in the fight. Some walked hundreds of miles from their homes to answer the emperor's call, trudging through heat and dust with determination burning in their chests. There was suffering on these marches, feet bleeding, hunger and disease taking a toll, but a profound sense of purpose kept them going. Each step toward the front line was a step toward preserving Ethiopia's sovereignty. The Italian invasion initially met sharp resistance at every turn. Early clashes proved the Ethiopians were no pushovers. In December 1895, at Amba Alagi, a rugged mountain pass, Ethiopian forces ambushed and decimated an Italian detachment, shocking the Italian high command. Those Italians who survived retreated in disarray. Further east, Italian forces fortified a stronghold at Mekelle, a town with a strategic water source. Empress Taytu arrived with Ethiopian troops and laid siege to the fort in January 1896. Instead of launching a costly frontal assault, Taytu employed a clever strategy that saved lives. She ordered her forces to cut off the fort's water supply. Under the scorching African sun, thirst began to break the Italian resolve. After days without water, the besieged Italian commander begged for a truce. Menelik, who had joined Taytu at Mekelle, agreed to let the desperate enemy withdraw, rather than perish of thirst. It was a merciful gesture in the midst of a brutal war, one that Menelik granted in part to show the world that Ethiopians were not the barbarians the Italians had imagined. As the Italian soldiers stumbled out, weak and dehydrated, Ethiopian onlookers felt a surge of confidence. They saw that the invader could bleed and be vanquished, and that their leaders tempered strength with compassion. Italy's high command, embarrassed by the setbacks, pressed for a decisive showdown. Fresh reinforcements arrived from Italy. Thousands of additional troops shipped across the sea into Eritrea. By late February 1896, the Italian commander, General Oreste Baratieri, had concentrated roughly 17,000 soldiers for a final push into the Ethiopian highlands. Facing him was Menelik's Grand Army, camped near the small town of Adwa in northern Ethiopia. Menelik had perhaps 6 times the number of fighters, though exact figures are uncertain. What was certain is that the Ethiopians, from foot soldiers to feudal lords, stood united under Menelik's banner, while the Italians were deep in hostile territory with stretched supply lines and a vastly outnumbered force. A climactic confrontation loomed, ready to decide Ethiopia's future and send ripples throughout history. Dawn broke over the mountains of Adwa on March 1st, 1896, and with it broke the will of an empire. In the pale morning light, the Italian army launched its attack, hoping to surprise Emperor Menelik's forces. General Baratieri, under pressure from Rome to win a quick victory, split his troops into 3 columns advancing through the steep, mist-shrouded valleys. Italian soldiers clutched their rifles and marched nervously, peering at peaks that loomed like dark silhouettes around them. The Ethiopian scouts had been watching every move. As the sun climbed, a vast panorama was revealed to the Italians. The hills teemed with Ethiopian warriors. Menelik and Taytu had deployed their army across the high ground. Flags bearing the Lion of Judah, the symbol of Ethiopian royalty, fluttered in the breeze. At Menelik's side were his top generals and regional princes, Ras Makonnen, Ras Alula, and others famed for courage. Taytu herself commanded cannon on a hilltop ready to rain fire. For a heartbeat, there was an eerie quiet, broken only by the distant rumble of war drums and the melodic chant of priests blessing the Ethiopian ranks with holy water and prayer. Suddenly, Ethiopia's defenders surged forward with a fearsome cry, Allahu Akbar and Imis Kyrios, prayers to God in both Muslim and Christian tongues, for Menelik's army included Ethiopians of multiple faiths united against foreign invaders. The Italians, startled and disorganized by the difficult terrain, found themselves overwhelmed. Ethiopian riflemen, many of them outfitted with modern guns, poured volleys into the Italian columns. Other Ethiopian warriors, armed with long curved swords and spears, charged with fearless intensity. The crack of rifle fire, the boom of cannon, and the battle cries of tens of thousands echoed off the mountains. Italian positions that had seemed secure one moment were suddenly flanked and overrun the next. General Baratieri's battle plan unraveled almost immediately. One Italian brigade wandered off course and was isolated. Another found itself nearly encircled by swarming Ethiopian fighters. Within hours, the battlefield became a scene of chaos and carnage. Italian artillery crews fired shell after shell, tearing gaps in the Ethiopian lines, but the waves of attackers kept coming, men and women willing to die rather than see their homeland in chains. Many Ethiopian fighters wore talismans and amulets, believing God was on their side. Indeed, they fought with a fervor and organization that stunned the Italians. It was a determined army employing clever tactics. Ethiopian commanders coordinated their units with signal flags and war drums. As one Italian officer admitted, their enemy moved as if guided by an unseen hand, enveloping the Italians from all sides. The carnage reached its peak by midday. Hand-to-hand combat ensued on some slopes, Ethiopian swordsmen crashing into Italian bayonets. In other areas, Italian lines simply broke and ran under relentless pressure. Entire Italian battalions were annihilated or scattered. General Baratieri, realizing the battle was lost, fled the field, narrowly escaping capture. By early afternoon, the tricolor Italian flag that had flown proudly in the morning lay trampled in blood-soaked dust. Victory belonged decisively to Emperor Menelik II and the Ethiopian forces. The Battle of Adwa was over, and against all expectations, the Ethiopians had won a landslide victory. Italian casualties were enormous. Around 6,000 of their soldiers lay dead or dying on that field, a scale of loss almost unheard of for a European army fighting Africans. Thousands more were injured, and about 3,000 were taken prisoner, marched off in defeat under the very eyes of those they had meant to conquer. Ethiopian casualties, too, were heavy. The price of freedom was steep, with perhaps 5,000 killed and more wounded, but their sacrifice had saved one whole nation. As dust from the last gunshot settled, Menelik II stood as the first African king in modern history to defeat a European colonial power in war. The news raced like wildfire. Ethiopian warriors danced and ululated in celebration, hoisting their flags and arms in triumph. There was joy, but also a somber sight. On the rocky slopes lay the intermingled bodies of Ethiopians and Italians, Christians both, now united in death. Menelik gazed upon the aftermath with a heavy heart. This victory was necessary, vital, but it was also tragic. According to accounts, Menelik remarked that he took no pleasure in the shedding of blood, especially Christian blood, even if it was the blood of invaders. His war had been against the ambitions of the Italian king and his generals, not against Italian young men who had been led to their doom. Menelik's anger for the oppressed had fueled his people's resistance. Now, that anger gave way to a dignified mercy for the vanquished. In camp that evening, the Ethiopian leaders met to decide their next steps. Empress Taytu, jubilant and still fiery, pressed to pursue the fleeing enemy into Eritrea and perhaps drive them into the sea. Some generals agreed the chance was there to utterly crush Italian colonial presence in the region. But Menelik demurred. He chose restraint over revenge. His aim was not conquest of foreign lands, but the security of Ethiopia. The Italian government was already humiliated. Pushing further might provoke other European powers to intervene against Ethiopia. Menelik's intuition proved wise. He declared that the goal of preserving Ethiopian sovereignty had been achieved at Adwa. "Why risk more when we have won it all today?" he implied. And so, instead of ordering an invasion of Eritrea, Menelik sent peace overtures to the shattered Italian command. This decision baffled some hot-headed patriots, but ultimately saved Ethiopia from overextension. Menelik understood the wider picture. Ethiopia had made its point. It was a free and independent nation, not to be trifled with, and even the most powerful outsiders would have to accept that fact. Across the African continent and the Black diaspora, word of Ethiopia's astonishing victory spread, igniting amazement and inspiration. Never before in the age of colonialism had an African army decisively defeated a European imperial force and forced it into retreat. This was more than a battlefield win. It was a blow to the very ideology of white supremacy that underpinned colonial conquest. For Italy, Adwa was a national humiliation of the highest order. The Italian Prime Minister crisply resigned in disgrace as angry protesters in Rome demanded answers for the disaster. In newspapers from London to Paris, from New York to St. Petersburg, headlines marveled at Menelik's feat. The myth of African inferiority had been dealt a stinging rebuke on the slopes of Adwa. Also, in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Adwa, Emperor Menelik II's attention turned to diplomacy and the fate of the thousands of Italian prisoners of war now in Ethiopian custody. These captives included common soldiers, officers, and even a general or two. Many were wounded, and all were anxious about their survival. European colonial armies were notorious for harsh reprisals. Had the roles been reversed, it was likely the Ethiopians would face brutal treatment, or even massacre. The Italians feared the Ethiopians might take revenge for atrocities committed during the invasion. Indeed, Italian forces had burned villages and committed abuses on their march, acts which had fueled Ethiopian anger. Now the tables were turned. White soldiers sat bound in the camp of a black African army, awaiting judgment. This reversal sent shockwaves through the racist imaginations of Europe. Rumors flew in European newspapers that the savage Abyssinians would torture or mutilate their prisoners. The Vatican itself grew deeply concerned, not necessarily out of pure humanitarian empathy, but also out of fear of reputational damage and the loss of Italian Catholic lives. The Pope is greatly disturbed, reported the New York Times in the weeks after Adwa. Pope Leo XIII, who led the Roman Catholic Church, watched the unfolding events with alarm and a touch of embarrassment. An army from a Catholic nation had been vanquished by those they viewed as inferior. The Pope decided to act, if only to urge clemency and protect the Italian captives from potential vengeance. Meanwhile, within Menelik's camp, a debate simmered. Some Ethiopian leaders, recalling how the Italians had come to enslave their country, argued that harsh punishment was justified. There were hot-blooded voices suggesting that Ethiopia should show strength by executing certain Italian officers, or at least keeping the prisoners indefinitely to deter future incursions. But Menelik II, having proven his strength on the battlefield, now chose to demonstrate the strength of his character. He convened his council and made his view clear. Ethiopia was not fighting to destroy Italy or kill for the sake of killing. They fought to be treated with respect and equality. Menelik believed that showing mercy to the defeated, in line with Ethiopia's Christian values, would bring greater honor to his victory than any act of revenge. Ultimately, Menelik's stance carried the day. The Ethiopian leadership agreed to spare the lives of the prisoners and treat them decently. Wounded Italians received medical care. In some cases, Ethiopian nurses and doctors tended to them using the limited resources available, side by side with Ethiopian wounded. The Italians, who had expected barbarity, instead encountered humanity and compassion from the very people they had sought to conquer. This was Ethiopian culture at its finest hour, firm in war but generous in peace. In May 1896, about 3 months after the battle, Pope Leo XIII took the extraordinary step of sending a personal envoy to Ethiopia. Since Italy and Ethiopia were still technically at war, as formal peace negotiations had not yet concluded, the Vatican's initiative was remarkable. The Pope's envoy, carrying a letter from Leo XIII, arrived at Menelik's royal encampment with cautious optimism. In the letter, the Pope addressed Menelik with respect, implicitly acknowledging him as a legitimate sovereign and fellow Christian. This in itself was a significant turnaround. Only a year earlier, European powers and perhaps even the Vatican had been ready to consider Menelik a mere client if Italy had its way. Now, the Pope was effectively pleading with an African emperor. The letter from Leo XIII urged Menelik to show mercy and Christian charity toward the Italian prisoners, invoking the bonds of faith that theoretically united all Christians. It was a polite yet desperate appeal to the victor's goodwill, asking that lives be spared and that Italy be given the chance to recover its defeated sons. The irony was not lost on Menelik or his courtiers. The same Vatican that had stood silent while Italy set out to colonize a Christian nation was now lecturing that nation about mercy. The hypocrisy was palpable, but Menelik chose not to answer cynicism with cynicism. Emperor Menelik II received the Vatican's envoy with full honors, demonstrating Ethiopia's civility on the world stage. Dressed in his imperial robes, Menelik listened to the Pope's plea. Then, the Ethiopian monarch penned a respectful reply. In his letter, Menelik assured Pope Leo that the Italian prisoners would be safe. He stated that as a king and as a father to his people, he would not permit unnecessary bloodshed. He wrote, "My duty as king and father of my people prevents me from sacrificing the sole guarantee of peace that I have with me." By this, Menelik meant that the Italian prisoners of war were a bargaining chip to ensure Italy honored peace terms. He would not harm them needlessly because their very existence guaranteed that Italy would negotiate honestly. It was a diplomatic way of saying their lives would be protected. To underscore his goodwill, Menelik went further. He ordered the release of one seriously ill Italian prisoner, entrusting the man to the papal envoy to be taken back to Italy. This gesture, a token of mercy to please the Pope, astonished the Italians. One sick and weakened soldier suddenly found himself free, simply because Menelik wished to send Pope Leo a sign of respect. For that young Italian, and for his grieving mother back home, this act was nothing short of a miracle. Indeed, one touching story later emerged in Italian papers. The freed soldier carried with him a letter from his widowed mother, which had reached him in captivity. The letter spoke of a mother's tears and prayers to the Virgin Mary for her only son's safe return. When Menelik heard this story, it is said his eyes filled with tears, and he told the soldier, "Your mother's tears and our shared love for the Mother of God have freed you. Go back to your mother and tell her that the Holy Virgin has saved you." This gesture spread through Europe and showcased Menelik's magnanimity. They stood in stark contrast to the lurid tales most Europeans had expected. There were no massacres of prisoners, no triumphant orgies of revenge. Instead, there was a Christian king acting with a dignity that shamed his detractors. All the while, formal negotiations opened between Italy and Ethiopia. Humiliated and eager to repatriate the rest of their captured soldiers, the Italians sued for peace. By October 1896, the Treaty of Addis Ababa was signed, officially ending the war. In that treaty, Italy recognized Ethiopia as a fully independent sovereign nation, repudiating once and for all the false protectorate claim from the Wuchale Treaty. Italy also agreed to pay a sizable indemnity for the repatriation of prisoners, essentially a ransom to get their soldiers back safely. Those roughly 2,000 Italian prisoners, once they had recovered sufficiently, were escorted by Ethiopian guides on a long march to the Red Sea coast. On the route, local Ethiopian villagers, who themselves had suffered under Italian attacks months before, often brought food and water for the prisoners. Many Ethiopians, while grieving their own dead, empathized with the enemy's ordinary soldiers, seeing them as pawns of distant rulers. Finally, as Italian ships carried these men home, the world looked on in amazement. An African nation had defeated a European power and then treated the vanquished more humanely than the vanquisher might have done. Back in Rome, the Vatican's relief at the safe return of Italian prisoners was surely mingled with introspection. The Pope and his cardinals had witnessed a startling role reversal. The head of the Roman Catholic Church, the same institution that once drew maps dividing non-European lands among colonial powers, had been compelled to beseech an African ruler for mercy, and that African Christian ruler had answered with true Christian forgiveness, arguably living out the Gospel's teachings more faithfully than the European aggressors had. This event laid bare the double standard and arrogance of the colonial era. The Vatican had blessed countless colonial endeavors for the spread of faith over the centuries, but at Adwa, a Christian African army fought off Catholic invaders, and it was the Africans who exemplified Christian values in victory. Menelik II had, in effect, fought the Vatican's proxy and won, and then extended grace rather than vengeance. In doing so, he exposed the Vatican's hypocrisy that the Church's representatives had aligned with colonial conquest, yet expected Christian mercy when the tables turned. Pope Leo XIII's outreach to Menelik, while laudable in humanitarian terms, tacitly acknowledged that the moral high ground lay with the Ethiopians. In the African diaspora, from the Caribbean to Black America, the psychological impact of the victory was profound. Black newspapers in the United States rejoiced at the Ethiopian victory, seeing it as a victory for all people of African heritage. Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican-born Pan-Africanist, would later cite Adwa as evidence for his Back to Africa vision, emphasizing that Ethiopia, often poetically called Zion, remained unchained and strong. Adwa's anniversary was celebrated by Black communities.
Elders.
Sermons in Black churches praised Menelik as a divinely guided leader. In South Africa and other parts of the continent, independent African churches sprouted, calling themselves Ethiopian churches. A spiritual movement rejecting European-dominated missions and embracing African-led Christianity. They took to heart the scripture verse, "Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands unto God," believing Ethiopia's example heralded a new era of African dignity. Even in Harlem, New York, one could find in later years restaurants and salons named after Abyssinia or Menelik, a testament to how deeply the victory resonated. To oppressed peoples, Ethiopia's success was a psychological emancipation, cracking the myth of white supremacy. If Ethiopia could defeat Italy, then someday, somehow, others could throw off their colonial masters too. Emperor Menelik II's reign after Adwa was largely peaceful externally, but he faced the tasks of consolidation and modernization. He negotiated treaties with Britain and France, defining Ethiopia's borders, securing recognition that was unthinkable before his victory. Ethiopia was now treated by Europe not as prey, but as a respected sovereign state, though some resentments lingered. Menelik used the window of peace to introduce modern innovations. A railway, telephones, a national currency, and new schools. He wanted to show that Ethiopia could progress on its own terms. At the same time, Menelik ensured that the world remembered what happened at Adwa. He commissioned artists to paint battle scenes and chronicle the victory. Ethiopian
The audio
envoys were
features
sent abroad,
rhythmic chanting
and
and
Menelik
praying
himself
from several
welcomed
priests.
foreigners to his court, always reminding them that Ethiopia remained uncolonized. There was pride in every mention of Adwa, a rightful pride that served as a shield against future encroachments. Yet the shadow of colonial ambition had not disappeared entirely. In Europe, some saw Adwa as a fluke, a mistake to be corrected. Nowhere was this sentiment stronger than in Italy. The sting of Adwa festered in the Italian national psyche. Decades later, in 1935, Italy, then ruled by fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, would launch a second invasion of Ethiopia, seeking revenge and a new Italian empire. This time, the Italians came with airplanes, poison gas, and a brutality that shocked the world. The Vatican, under Pope Pius XI, did not openly endorse the fascist aggression, but nor did it firmly condemn it. Many Italian clergymen even blessed Mussolini's troops as they set off to civilize Ethiopia once again, revealing a tragic moral failure among church leaders. For a brief period, from 1936 to 1941, Italy succeeded in occupying Ethiopia through sheer technological force and terror, something they could not do in Menelik's era. Emperor Menelik II had passed away by then, and his successor, Emperor Haile Selassie, led a difficult resistance and pleaded for help from the League of Nations. The world's indifference in 1935 stood in stark contrast to the awe it had shown in 1896. It was as if the Vatican and the great powers had learned very little. The old hypocrisy persisted, ready to sacrifice justice for political expedience. However, even Mussolini's conquest was not the end of Ethiopia's story. Haile Selassie returned in 1941 with British Allied forces to liberate Ethiopia, and the Italians were expelled once more. Ethiopia resumed its independent path, the only African country, besides Liberia, to have evaded permanent colonization. The legacy of Menelik II and the Adwa victory remained a bedrock of Ethiopian national identity. The memory of that day in 1896 continued to inspire anti-colonial fighters from Kenya to Ghana to Zimbabwe throughout the 20th century. When African nations achieved independence in the 1950s and 60s, many of their leaders paid homage to Ethiopia's example. Addis Ababa, Ethiopia's capital founded by Menelik, became the host city for the African Union, a continental body aiming for solidarity. This was no coincidence. Ethiopia's endurance had been a guiding light. Today, Emperor Menelik II is regarded by many Africans as a hero who stood up not just for Ethiopia, but for the dignity of Africa as a whole. No, he was not a flawless man, but in the context of facing down colonialism, he embodied a righteous struggle. Menelik combined courage, cleverness, and compassion, disproving the colonial lie that Africans were incapable of statecraft or unworthy of self-rule. The saga of Emperor Menelik II, the African king who fought the Vatican and won, remains one of the most remarkable in modern history. It is a story of African sovereignty vindicated. Ethiopia, an ancient nation, affirmed its right to exist as equal to any nation on earth, shattering the biased doctrines of its day. The Vatican, symbol of Western Christianity, had stood aligned with an unholy war of conquest. But in the end, the Pope had to bow to a reality he could not change. An African emperor had defeated a Catholic power and then exemplified Christian virtues better than the would-be conquerors. Emperor Menelik, the second story, will forever remind the world that principles of freedom and justice, when defended with courage, can prevail against even the greatest of odds. Thank you for giving your time to a story that deserves to be remembered with clarity and respect. If this video gave you something to think about, make sure to hit the like button to show that world that these narratives matter. Share your thoughts in the comments to keep the conversation going. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Subscribing helps us continue bringing forward powerful stories and overlooked truths from our past. Turn on notifications so you never miss our next uploads. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next one.